We start the meeting in this afternoon. Of course, first of all, with the exchange of views with Mr. Guy Verhofstadt, our Parliament Brexit negotiator, and Mr. Elmar Brok, member of the Brexit steering group, on the, of course, UK's withdrawal from the EU. Our committee interest to the subject was expressed in several occasions. We most recently held a public hearing on the impact of the UK's withdrawal from the EU on, of course, environment, public health and food safety. And it was made clear during the hearing that UK's withdrawal from the EU could have a severe impact on areas falling under within the remit of the committee. And a number of questions and concerns were raised during the hearing. It was agreed that these would be transmitted to our negotiators, which is why I sent a letter to Mr. Barnier outlining these concerns and why we have invited Mr. Verhofstadt and Mr. Brok and Mr. Gualtieri to attend our meeting today. So, without further delay, I would like to give the floor first to Mr. Verhofstadt to allow him briefly present the progress made so far in the negotiations and to allow, of course, to outline the next steps. So, you have the floor, Mr. Verhofstadt.
Thank you very much, Chair. And first of all, I want to thank the ENVI Committee for the invitation to come to you together with Elmar to your meeting. And also thank ENVI Chair Adina Valian and the whole committee also for the input that we received with the Brexit steering group. And it was very, very, very crucial and useful when we adopted the three resolutions, because until now we have adopted three key resolutions in the Parliament. So, if I may, Mrs. Valian, do my intervention in two parts. The first part mainly on the general approach that we have on Brexit with the Brexit steering group and the work that we are planning for the coming months. And then, if I may, I want in my second part come to the specific ENVI, the issues that concerning the competence of ENVI, and also put for you, if I may, 5 key questions that we have, in my opinion, to respond in this next phase of the negotiations on the issues of ENVI. That should be my approach. First of all, on the general approach, as you know, we adopted a resolution on the 13th of December. Council did approve the joint report that was agreed between the UK and the EU, saying and concluding that there was sufficient progress on the three main issues. The three main issues, you know them: citizens' rights, financial settlement, and the issue of Ireland. And it means that together, Council and Parliament, in fact, came to the conclusion that sufficient progress was there, but sufficient progress, that doesn't mean that all problems are solved. Sufficient progress means that the progress is sufficient. Not that all the remaining points on the table have been dealt with. And that is certainly the case also in this file, because while sufficient progress has been made, it's clear that on citizens' rights there is still an enormous concern, and there is a hearing organized by committees, Libe, Juri, and Employ on this, on the procedure that will be followed by the British authorities. And this procedure on citizens' rights will be put into the withdrawal agreement. So there will be a lot of work to do to secure that this procedure is a citizen-friendly procedure. Because, you know, when public authorities are saying a procedure will be simple, I'm not always sure that it is simple. Normally, it's the opposite. So we, as Parliament, is the first defender of citizens' rights, and we have to get this right. So that's the. what we did in the past. What is now the work for the future? There are, in fact, three things to do, three key challenges, and three what I call work streams that we will organize in the Parliament. The first is we need to formalize the progress report into the withdrawal agreement. So translate the progress report into a formal text of the withdrawal agreement. So citizens' rights, financial settlement, and the Irish issue. And that is not only these 3 points, that are the 3 key points, because there are also a number of additional issues that need to be tackled. The second work stream will be the agreement to reach before March on transition. There is the need of a transition, and how it will work, what will be the system in place, need to be agreed before March, and we, from our side, have to agree with the approach that Council will take on this. And then the third work stream and the third element that needs to be done is an agreement, is the start of negotiations from March on, not from now, but from March on the future relationship. And that needs to lead to a political declaration that will be a separate document or an annex. I think as Parliament we think that the best is an annex of the withdrawal agreement. So the withdrawal agreement will have 2 parts. The withdrawal agreement as such, with the 3 key issues, citizens' rights, Ireland, and the financial settlement, and an agreement on the transition. So the agreement on the transition will make part of the Article 50 withdrawal agreement. And then there will be an annex of this withdrawal agreement, probably, mostly, that it is the political declaration of the future relationship between the EU and UK. And all this needs to be done for March 2018. So, in political terms, that means tomorrow. That needs to be done within less than 10 months. It's 9 months. It's normally you can have a baby in 9 months, but I'm not so sure that this will be sufficient time. It needs to be done in this 9 or 10 months. How we will organize ourselves in the European Parliament on this? On the first work stream, on the withdrawal agreement, as already indicated, it's the translation of the progress report in the withdrawal agreement, and there we will put, as Parliament, special attention to the procedure that will be followed on the citizens' rights. And this procedure is for us a key element, because you can guarantee to the citizens, the EU citizens living in Britain, and to the UK citizens living on the continent, the same rights as they have now, but everything is depending on procedure. If the procedure is to obtain that status, because the settled status is no longer in the progress report. So in the beginning, the naming was settled status. That had been skipped. But if the procedure is so difficult that it becomes a bureaucratic nightmare for the people to obtain it, then that doesn't mean anything at all. So for the Parliament, having a procedure that is spontaneous, automatic, without any administrative burden for the EU citizens, will be key. The second work stream will be on transition. The General Affairs Council will, on the 29th of January, adopt the guidelines for the negotiation with Britain on the transition. There, the Brexit Steering Group has given a positive opinion and advice towards the General Affairs Council on these guidelines. Mainly, these guidelines are saying the following thing. That is, that the transition can only be the continuation of the acquis communautaire, of the existing situation. So no change, no cherry picking, no, for example, saying, in the transition we like the customs union but not the single market. Or, for example, inside the single market we like the freedom of movement of goods and services and capitals, but not the freedom of movement of people. So the transition will be simply the continuation of the membership without membership of Britain of the whole acquis, with one exception, that is the representation of Britain in the different bodies who decide on this. So there will no longer be a representation of the UK in the Parliament, in the Commission, in the European Court of Justice, in the European Court of Auditors, and in the European Commission. So it's the membership without representation, I should say, that is mainly the transition. All policy stays intact, all legislation continues to apply, the oversight of the European Court of Justice continues, but there will be no representation of the UK in the bodies in the political bodies steering the European Union during this transition period. And the second important thing in these guidelines is that the new system for the EU citizens living in Britain will only be applied after the transition, what is normal. So the new system of citizens' rights where we are discussing on and the procedure where we are discussing on will be applicable after transition. During transition, this is the normal situation. It's the acquis communautaire which is applicable. So that, and that's the third element, how long, when ends the transition period. The proposal in the guidelines is to end the transition on December 2020. Parliament, as you know, in its first resolution, have been a little bit more open about this and has indicated a maximum period for the transition of 3 years. So we are saying to the negotiator, look, okay, we can agree with your idea to end the transition in December 2020, but you can be a little bit flexible on it, as we think is needed in these negotiations. And then the third working stream of Parliament in the coming months will be to formulate in a new resolution that will be put into the plenary session of March in the March session in the European Parliament, a resolution on how we as European Parliament see the future relationship between the UK and the EU. And there is absolutely key that your committee is giving us the input for everything concerning health, public health, concerning environment standards, food safety, everything what concerns the competence of ENVI. Because it will be an extensive resolution. It will not be a resolution of a few paragraphs. It will be a resolution around 60 paragraphs, so a more, I should say, common resolution in the European Parliament, giving our opinion about this future relationship. We have already indicated that in our opinion it has to be an association agreement based on Article 217 of the treaty, but what we will do is chapter after chapter indicate how we see it, how we see the trade relationship, how we see the thematic cooperation, how we see the cooperation on internal security, home security, how we see the cooperation on external security, what in our point of view are the 4 pillars of this agreement that we have to make. To prepare this, Chair, we are organizing at this moment, today and already 2 days ago, a number of in-camera seminars with the European Commission. And that goes in parallel with the Council. Commission is organizing it with the Brexit working group of the Council, and Commission is organizing it with the Brexit steering group of the Parliament, and that is in total on 7 topics, in 4 in-camera seminars, a discussion with the Commission and the Brexit steering group. And in the Brexit steering group are invited not only the members of the Brexit steering group, but also the committee chairs, and also the coordinators of the groups that are represented in the Brexit steering group and that have adopted and approved the resolutions of the Parliament. One of these 7 topics that we are discussing and preparing in these seminars in camera is one that is especially important for ENVI and where the ENVI will be invited to, that is on the level playing field. And that concerns especially also the environmental standards, standards on public health, standards on food safety that are and will be applicable in the future. So this invitation will come into your direction, and based on these seminars, there will be a text prepared by the Brexit Steering Group, send it to you on your topics so that you can discuss in your committee if this fulfill the wishes, the opinions and the position of the ENVI committee on that specific part of the future resolution that we will adopt normally in the mid of March. And I'm coming then to my last point. What will be or what are the specific issues there? I think that I'm opening pushing an open door. I don't know if you say that in English, but I think so, pushing an open door when I'm saying that concerning environment, climate change, public health, food safety, that are not only serious problems, but it are areas that are not geographically blind. It's not because you think borders are not fully fulfilling the role that they have to play in these things, because political borders or legal jurisdictions are not very useful in this. On top of that, second point, second remark that I want to make is that 2,000 pieces of EU legislation are today applicable on environment, climate change, public health, food safety in the European Union, and are also applicable to the UK. And it is clear that a Brexit will have a huge effect on these matters. And it's also, and that's my third point, clear that all these 2,000 pieces of EU legislation and the different safeguards that they contain cannot simply disappear on the day of Brexit. And that transitional measures will be required. A lot of that will be solved naturally by the transition period itself. Because after the withdrawal in 2019 until initially 2021, there will be transition, and in this period it will be the full application of these 2,000 pieces of legislation. So there will change nothing at all in this intermediate period. But afterwards, we have to define inside this agreement, in our idea and association agreement based on 217, how it will work. And I see, if you allow me, and that will be my conclusion for my intervention, Mrs. Valian, there will be, in my opinion, 5 key questions to answer. And that you have to answer, and that we together have to answer in our resolution in March. The first is, how do we ensure that the UK maintains the same environmental and food safety standards as the EU, what is naturally particularly important in the light of our future trade relations? How are we going to do it? How are we going to ensure it? The second is, how are you going to guarantee that future decisions of the UK as a third country on environmental policy do not have a negative effect on the rest of Europe? That's, in my opinion, the second safeguard and the second point, that a mechanism that we have to discuss, because there will be, once out, they are a third country. In transition, you can still say, yeah, they are out, but there is transition, so there is no problem. But after transition, how to secure that their decisions on this issue is not affecting all policies? The third question, I think, that your committee needs to tackle is and advise to us is how to maintain rapid access to something what is key for citizens, that is safe medicines, for both, for the UK, people living in the UK, and for people living in the EU 27 in the future. Because, they are out of the European Medicine Agency. How are we going to secure this? The fourth question that I put to you, and where I hope that your committee can reflect on it for the resolution is that how do we deal with mutual recognition of studies, of professional qualification when it comes to people working, for example, in the health sector, as a key example of what we're going to face. And last question is that I want to put to you how to safeguard exchange of important knowledge and information. Let me give you an example, drug safety, for example. That is an important information that we have maybe to secure with them, and on the opposite, them to secure with us. And certainly ongoing rapid events in food safety. Tomorrow there can happen something. I come from a country that even changed a government because of a food safety problem. And that was a huge shock. How you deal with this in a future environment where the UK is not longer part. But you have not to laugh, Mr. Stas. You know very well what I'm talking about. It was the chance for your party to enter in a government. So, okay. But okay. That said, I think that are the 5 key issues. Maybe there are others, but I think at least the 5 key issues that we need to answer in the resolution, not by making 100 pages of report, no, by simply stating, okay, that's our opinion how it should work. That's our opinion how it should work. And then our task with the Brexit Steering Group and Elmar Brok especially will be to influence in the meetings where we invited also the guidelines of the Council so that it goes in this direction. And I'm very pleased that I'm invited here to listen to you, not so much remarks, but your suggestions on these 5 issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Verhofstadt. Already I think a lot of things draw our attention in your presentation. Some of them have already discussed it in our committee, some novelties also, so I assume colleagues will have a lot of interest. Now, first, before giving the floor to colleagues, I would like to invite Mr. Brok to make some consideration on the topic. So please, Mr. Brok.
Thank you very much. Allow me a few remarks complementary to that, what he has said, because I think that is one of the good examples in the European Parliament that we in the Brexit Steering Group have until now not yet have principal problems with each other. That might come still, but at the moment it's a very good collegial cooperation, and I must say in my long time in the European Parliament I have very seldom seen how close Parliament in such questions was.
Sorry, can the speaker speak up a bit and into the microphone? I'm finding him very, very hard to understand.
It's my shyness which always prevents me from that, but I will try my best. The second point is, and he rightly speaks about this motion of resolution. You have to put there 60 points, meet taking away the general points, 2 for every committee, in real terms, not to have wrong expectations. That you work in that way, half a 1-page paper. But every committee does that, then we are in trouble. So ask you to concentrate on the general and important questions, not on the details in this stage, in which direction it should go. When it comes to the transitional period, if it's done that way as we define it, then there should be no problem. All the acquis communautaire has to be applied. And that is not the serious problem. And also, the change of the acquis communautaire in these 2 or 3 years of transitional period has to be applied. But I think this has to be controlled also from your point of view, but that would not mean the major problem. The question what we have is in the future, in one part you mentioned in your expert paper here, Northern Ireland. If we understand the sufficient progress in the point Northern Ireland is that there will be a regulatory similarity between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and therefore you have to look into that case, what it means also for environmental questions, food safety questions and so on. Because here we have to be very cautious. These are the practical problems we will arouse with this principle what was agreed, and here I think you must have a look with your experience on that. When it comes to the further agreement, it means this is agreement with a third country. it's not the further development of the present situation. It's a new agreement with a third country. And this means the negotiation from the very beginning, like we do it in trade negotiations, something like in Canada. There we should be aware of it. And here we have to see how we phrase it, that standards can have that level we need in order to open our markets. Here we have to be very cautious that this has to be done, and that also is not done in a way that the role of the European Parliament as legislator is overcome by regulatory cooperation between administrations. Always the classical failure in trade agreements. Because until now, Britain does not want to have a free the membership in the internal market. They do not want to have the Norwegian solution because it means taking on board all the legislation, paying money, fulfill the question of the four freedoms. And they do not want to do that. So it's a classical trade agreement besides some questions on research, on Erasmus, and security. And I think that should be aware. And here I think we have the examples of that. And I mean that this, for example, internal market and environment, one of the interesting parts will be the agreement on fishery. 93% of the British fishermen have voted for Brexit. But they call now for a bigger market share of in the European Union. Until now, 65% of the exports goes to the European Union. I told them that intellectually I have not brought the two figures, 93 and 65, together. Here we have to be very cautious and need to advise that these questions in fishing grounds, the quota systems in fisheries and on, that I think it is also not just a question of the Fisheries Committee, but should be also a question whether the Environmental Committee should look in. So all the other questions, I think, is the classical, as I said, free trade agreement. I found an interesting figure in your paper on public health and especially on pharmaceutical questions. It is written 70% of EU investigational medicinal products are released from the UK. That sounds very overwhelming. But is this a result because all that done is in Britain, or is it a result of the medical agency, which is now going out of the United Kingdom?
The majority of the experts are UK citizens.
No, the products. The investigation is done because of the agencies until now in London. They prove it. And will this number stay with 70%? Because of the agency it does not play a role in that, or is it a result of the agency is in London? I'm not clear on that, and that we should look into that case. I cannot imagine that 70% of all the development of pharmaceutical products in Europe is done in the United Kingdom. I'm not quite sure if I see the strengths of pharmaceutical companies in some European countries, including mine. And therefore, it would be very interesting to check these figures again, which is... Yeah, no, because I think check that. I think it's an important reason to check that and clarify. I do not know, but it's my guess that there might be a problem in understanding that question. Anyway, we have to do something about it. But I think that in this question of pharmaceutical products, I think he has said it too, applies the same. Third country, and the third country has to be checked in a free trade negotiation that way that our standards are controllable, fulfilled. The last point, as the expert have said to you, because of the big relationship in the questions of food safety and pharmaceutical products, it should be not damaging politics done so that it will crash. that would mean, it could mean, that Britain in these questions get an open door of the European market, a de facto member of the internal market, without paying the contribution to the internal market. If by products or branches by branches, in the financial sector they will use even more this argument. It runs so smoothly, let's stay as it is. Then we have a situation that in practical terms the United Kingdom has the entrance on the internal market like a member of the European Union without paying the contributions to the European Union in solidarity for structural funds, in allowing the rights of the European Court of Justice, allowing free movement of labour, and all that questions. I think also in these questions, for sure we should have not so deep shocks, should one point not be forgotten, that we have in the guidelines from springtime written, and also in the resolution of the European Parliament, a country which leaves the European Union cannot have similar advantages like a country who stays in the European Union and takes all the obligations of the European Union. I think if we do not honor this sentence, we are in a mess. Because that would mean the message, you can go out, pay no money, don't take care of anything, but you have the same business. And here I think we should be very cautious. The starting point again is they are out. The negotiations are with a third country. It's from the beginning. And it's not a question that automatically it can be taken over without fulfilling obligations as part of the internal market. And here I'm afraid the more we come to sector, in this different sector, it's easy to believe we make it quite open, but in the overall context, then we result in a mess. And I ask you to check that in a proper way, that we can do this policy to fulfill this question, no similar advantages. That is not a punishment, it's a result. Because if there's a similar effects, it's a punishment for our member countries who pay the obligations. And it came to me as I read your annex here that there could be seen such a misunderstanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We heard you loud and clear. It might be that in some sectors, like public health, would be a bit more complicated, but nevertheless, I'll let my colleagues to comment on that. I have 12 speakers. I start with the coordinators, and of course, the first one, Mr. Liese. 2.5 minutes. This would be the rule because it's a limited time. Peter.
Vielen Dank, Frau Vorsitzende.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to Guy Verhofstadt and Elmar Brok. I think the general line set out by the two of them is one we share in the committee on the transitional agreement, first of all. I think it's important to stress that there should be no departure from the acquis communautaire, in particular environment, health and food safety. I agree what Guy Verhofstadt said. If we go beyond the end of 2020, that might be good. The longer the transitional agreement, the greater the chance that people come to their senses in the British Isles, and they might realise that Brexit was a bad idea. I have two specific questions on environment. I had a meeting with the chemical industry in Germany. They said the most important point is that REACH remains as it is, that the UK continues to apply REACH. We didn't think that would be the case some time ago, but that was the statement. That's the opinion of the chemical industry, also in the UK. The Environment Minister, secondly, Michael Gove, the UK Minister, says he doesn't want less environmental protection, rather more. I suspect that this is just to find arguments for Brexit. Whether he actually wants that in the long term, I'd like to have the estimation of the two colleagues on that. Coming on health, that's difficult. The 70%, I can't believe the 70%. I'd ask for more information, and that's not the way I see it. Industry, patients, doctors, and even the British government say, in the area of health, we want to leave everything as it is. Before we talk about that, the Brits should put that on the table. If representatives of the UK say that we want everything to stay as it is, the minister must first say that that's what he wants. That's a partial rolling back of Brexit. They voted for Brexit, and we must see that as a given. If that changes, we can negotiate it. That would be my assessment, and we must say that in the larger connection, the bigger picture that Elmar Brok set out.
Much now, Mr. Das, on behalf of Asandi.
Thank you. Just very quickly, it always hurts when you talk about the UK as a third country. You're right to do so, but it hurts. And obligatory thing to say, you know that there are many. You know this. There are many people in my country fighting this, and will continue to do so. But that aside, it is happening at the moment, and there are many things that you have alluded to that are extremely important. Just vis-à-vis the transition, very quickly, it is important the status quo remains for two reasons. Firstly, to provide the continuity and certainty that we need. But secondly, business has often said that they don't want two changes, they only want one change. And so I think that what you've outlined makes perfect sense. Not that that won't be a political row back home, of course, because it will. Firstly, on the environmental standards, of course, there are many people who have argued that Brexit is an opportunity to race to the bottom, to, in effect, strip away all of the protections that we have at an EU level to outcompete the EU. This is a naked ambition of many, including Messrs Farage, Fox and others who have publicly stated this. Will it be clear in the resolution that when it comes to the future trade relationship, that in any treaty, in any free trade agreement or whatever it looks like, there will be an explicit mention that existing environmental protection laws have to stay in place? Because, of course, at a European level, they were always the community minimum. Countries were always free to build on them as they so chose. But that would be a very important point. The second point is on the enforcement of that, because, of course, leaving the ECJ means that not only the Commission's powers of enforcement become uncertain, but actually citizens' rights to hold the government to account, as we've seen in several cases, most notably Client Earth in taking the UK government to court on its infractions. What can we say in this resolution that explicitly references the ability to legally enforce what we're saying about those standards? And the third point, access to medicine has to be a priority in phase 2 of these negotiations. Making sure that the supply of medicines to patients is safeguarded and putting in place negotiating directives to ensure the certainty in the supply and the quality of medicines has to be a key goal. I appreciate Elmar Brok says we can't go into details, but if we have an explicit commitment to that in the resolution, that would be extremely good. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Madame Gerling.
Thank you very much. My question was rather similar to Seb's in that I wanted to understand what the future trading relationship would demand of the UK in terms of environmental compliance, because, as he quite rightly says, that is the current minimum for being part of the single market. So if there is going to be a bespoke deal for the single market, which is the phraseology used in London, then there must be an environmental element to that. And what slightly worries me is that the environmental element never really comes to the front. People do talk about it because it's motherhood and apple pie, but it never seems to me that it's ever going to be central to any agreement and could be something that could easily be negotiated away or watered down. So I'd like to make a plea for it to come more centrally. But taking Mr. Brok's point about detail, of course, how can you talk about that in detail? It's really an establishment of a principle that I guess I'm after. Secondly, when we talk about the transitional period, it's not clear to me what that actually means. To me, it's really like an extension of the Article 50 negotiations, because there will be so much still to be agreed during that transitional period, and I suspect that most of the environmental issues will come into that. So is it really a transitional period? Because that's about allowing an agreement to settle in, and yet I don't have the feeling that the agreement in any detail form will be available for that transitional period. And just a question about how the Parliament is going to be. I mean, I recognise that I, as a British member, won't be in the Parliament after middle of next year, but the Parliament presumably will still have a say during the transitional period on the deal without British MEPs. So I wonder if you could just lay out exactly how you see that happening for your group, for you leading the Parliament's position, and how you see that operating during a transitional period, and how you see, if any, there would be any input for any UK voice in that.
Mr. Gerbrandi.
I think I'm speaking on behalf of ALDE. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. And like Seb and like Julie, hearing us being referred to as third country is painful. And yes, we're both still fighting. But the UK has been a member for over 40 years, and we have adopted a great number of environmental laws and entered into a multitude of environmental agreements, and actually been party to driving that forward, many of which set binding targets. This includes everything from commitments under the Paris Agreement to standards on industrial emissions and the protection of wildlife, right through the Birds and the Habitats Directive and onwards. And given the cross-border nature of tackling environmental problems, it would be catastrophic if the UK simply walked away from these agreements and dumped its environmental standards on the rest of Europe. And I see that you're aware of that. Mrs May and Mr Gove, the Environment Secretary, recently came up with a 25-year environmental plan, which sounds good. But just today we hear that the UK is digging its heels in the Council and against the recycling target of 65% of urban waste by 2035. So, you know, already, even though we haven't left, they're beginning to balk against targets that certainly this Parliament went further than that. And the fear is that Mr Gove has a big pair of scissors and he's waiting to chop up 40 years of environmental protection. And, you know, we're not a third country coming in having to raise our standards. We comply, or mostly, with the European legislation. And if we don't, there is a sanction on us. But the mantra of the referendum was that we must take back control. So if we are now at that standards, we can only assume that taking back control will be to reduce standards. And how Brits will enforce its environmental standards is something that we in the UK will have to do once we're away from the European Court of Justice. But where are the safeguards for the European Union? Where are the penalties? And how will these affect the EU is vitally important. And it's not just environment and medicines. It includes trade in wildlife products and the criminal activity of illegal wildlife products. So it's not just the environment, it's greater than that. I would like to see cast iron guarantees in the withdrawal agreement so that it is an international treaty with all the protections that international treaties have in the status of the world, so that if we can get those cast iron guarantees into that. I have other things here. The access to medicine is two-way, of course. Don't ever forget that it's both ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Now, Mr. Flanagan.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to question you. You are basically our negotiator on Brexit. When I got elected to the Parliament, I was asked to come out here and represent the views of my constituents, and now you are going to be the person who will ultimately represent these views and represent the views of the European Parliament on Brexit. In my opinion, you're here, you're in the job all right. I think it's far from ideal that you've been chosen for this job, given your views on basically what is a glorified United States of Europe. I think one of the main reasons the UK left the EU was because of this headlong rush towards more integration, and you symbolise this. And before the Brexit referendum, you described the UK as being a dwarf if it left. So my worry is, and the question I have for you on this is, are you going to prove yourself right by turning Britain into a dwarf, which would cause a problem for Ireland, a massive problem for Ireland, giving our massive codependence on our trading relationship with them? Have you gone away from that idea that the UK has to be a dwarf if it leaves? And are you conscious of the fact that if you're in a relationship with someone, if you tell them one of the reasons they shouldn't leave you is that they would be a dwarf, is that they will be gone the following morning, and maybe you played a part in this. But you're here now, and this is your job, so we've got to rely on you. You said your committee is given input. That's fantastic news, because we had a discussion at the Agri Committee and here today on the Envi Committee about what our input is going to be. We had talks about potentially inviting yourself or Mr Barnier into the committee, but we kind of fell down a bit on the whole structure of how we would input into it. You say that a resolution will come out to committees for approval after it is drafted. Now, surely it should make more sense, you've heard of the phrase, a stitch in time saves nine, if you actually talk to us beforehand and some formal structure was set up. And I'm just wondering what you would think about this. I know time is going to be a challenge. Two other questions. Where do you think the border between the EU and the UK should be? And finally, there is a huge focus on many areas, but what about the impact on fishing? Where will all the EU fleets go now when the UK grounds are lost? In particular, will they end up coming into Irish grounds, which we get a minimal amount out of anyways? Good luck with your job. Don't agree with you on everything, but we need you to do a good job. I hope you do.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor now. Mr. Taylor, yes, you.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I didn't hear you. Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much for the presentation and the opportunity to mention a couple of things. I'll be concentrating on one thing. I share the view with most of the parties here. But one thing I'd like to ask you is that the briefing that you sent was talking about the environmental acquis. And the appliance to that, adherence to that. But actually, I'm interested also in animal welfare, which is not mentioned in this briefing, but I think nevertheless is a very important measure to understate in terms especially of farm animals, wildlife, pets, and lab animals. And I think there's quite a large number of legislations referring to those issues affecting trade, which need to be secured for the benefit of Europe. Because who knows what happens subsequent to Brexit if the British government actually decides that it doesn't want to have as high a standard for instance, on hormone-fed beef or chlorinated chickens or GMO, if the British government wants to actually reduce those standards, we need to ensure, and we being Europe, need to ensure that we've been quite specific in mentioning animal welfare in the resolution. So thank you. I'd be grateful of your feedback on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Madame Reid.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Well, unlike many of my co-committee people here, I believe that Brexit will be an opportunity for Britain to thrive. And various EU legislations have caused problems in the UK, CAP being one of them. The drive for these very large farms growing cereal crops, and we've seen hedgerows being grubbed out. Set aside was yet another one, where farmers in my area put crops that were under cultivation set aside and then ploughed up tracts of downland instead. So we lost all that to the environment. And an apiarist friend of mine who was asked to look after some bees, he found that they were starving because these huge fields that have very little in them other than just cereal crops, there's nothing for our bees or our pollinators to feed on. And another thing in the past, milk quotas which we've had, and the farmers in the UK going away from cows and the pastures of wildflowers. So I believe we have an opportunity. Mr Gove has said that he's going to look to more for the wildflower fields. And so I really believe that it's an opportunity for us to do well. And obviously we want to trade and we want to be friends with our near neighbours. But we would want to have the opportunity to make laws for ourselves, and hopefully we can come to some sort of agreement where we really don't want the EU to be telling us what we have to do, say 10 years from now.
Okay. Now, Madame Melin.
Messieurs, merci de nous.
Thank you for taking stock on the negotiations. For my group, I noted the 5 questions you stressed in particular. I note the first point. You talk about keeping up the same standards in the UK as in Europe. It's important to keep up those standards. You almost said, Mr. Brok said this. I think the two sides face a new situation. The UK will be a third country, and there are the consequences coming from that. There's a 6th point raised by Mr. Flanagan, is to determine where the front borders are in France. From after the Calais agreements, thousands of migrants are held up in France. They go around France. They go from different types of accommodation. That takes 14 to 16 months. 80% are sent away and come back to Calais in sanitary conditions which are unacceptable in terms of what's decent. So there is urgent to negotiate where the borders will be, and we expect a lot of you on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Madam McGuinness.
Thank you, Chair, and my thanks to both Mr Verhofstadt and Brok for their presentation and for clearly asking us 5 questions on how. And the difficulty is that the answers to these questions can only come when we know what the United Kingdom will decide on. But I want to run through, in the short time available, some of the real consequences on patient safety, and others have addressed this around pharmaceuticals. For example, if you take the issue of access to medicines, there are 45 million patient packs supplied from the United Kingdom to EU 27 every month, 37 million in the reverse. So there is an integrated trade in these products, completely commonly organised. What will happen to that? I'm not sure if they would like to tell us what they think the UK want, because the more I speak to UK colleagues, the more I hear that they want to keep as close as possible, but how that will be achieved is the question for us. So on the issue of cross-border movement of qualifications, there are issues particularly on the island of Ireland. We have had excellent cross-border health care through the European Union. How will this be impacted? I spent 3 hours with the Irish Medical Organisation going through very specific points on this issue. So I don't have the time to deal in detail, but I want to stress to all of our colleagues here that there are real patient safety issues if there is any divergence from the current system. I mean any divergence. The pharmaceutical industry have been in this Parliament in their droves trying to stress to us their need to stay within the current regime, including the EMA. Norway, we know, are party to all the agencies, party to all the expertise, but they don't have voting rights. So to answer the question of how we have to hear what the UK are saying, this also applies to issues around environmental protection and food safety. And the question around food safety will really become very worrying when the United Kingdom, if it manages to achieve trade agreements with third parties when it is no longer part of the European Union, and how it will then change its standards around food safety. And the tragedy for us here is we're trying to negotiate in a vacuum. We have no idea what the United Kingdom really wants. I think we need to know we want to protect our citizens and our markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Leinen.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. If the UK leaves the single market, I think we can fear that we'll get to different standards in environmental protection and health and food safety. That has been announced many times by the Brexiteers, that they want to have different standards. And just at the moment, there is the fact that Theresa May is contradicting our targets for plastics. We have many examples. It won't get better, it'll get worse. As for other trade agreements, we can try to have a regulatory committee to keep a tight ship. But I would say we are 27 countries, the UK is one country. It can't have the tail wagging the dog, rather the other way around. It can't be that the UK drags us down or drags us somewhere to a place where the bloc of 27 doesn't want to be. Given the time, I just want to address one topic. I think the UK will be leaving the Euratom Treaty. So there are lots of questions. The EU is the owner of the nuclear material. We have safety standards for nuclear plants, also for waste. Cross-border information with accidents. There are many questions coming from that if you leave the Euratom Treaty. Thank you.
And it's not the last one, but Mr. Karl-Heinz Florenz.
Listening to all that, it's quite clear that we expect that standards will be different. If the standards are different, I just wonder to what extent the 27 countries are prepared for these standards to be examined in chemicals. I'm also thinking of building materials, the use of asbestos. Are the European countries, the 27, are they prepared to have to check a new third country agreement?
Thank you. And Madame Cabezon-Ruiz.
Gracias. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Well, I understand that there is a lot of uncertainty, especially in the area of health, and essentially with all subjects related to Brexit. But I don't think that this uncertainty means that we have a major problem. I think the major problem, really, fundamentally speaking, when we speak to those who are involved in the Brexit negotiations, the real issue is a problem with the UK. The UK is diverging from the EU's standards and from this community. And they are going to continue diverging, I believe. So we need to find an agreement so that we can be sure that our standards are upheld. And this would mean a lot of different things. Well, when it comes to healthcare professionals, there are 140,000 that live in the country that are not UK, and that's about 14% of nurses are not from the UK, and essentially there hasn't been as many people being trained in the UK. They have therefore been poached from other countries. So we're going to need these standards for these healthcare professionals. And there must be recognition of professional qualifications so that we can find a ways for people to be able to go from one side to the other without any issues. And that's going to be extremely important for UK. Now, when it comes to research, when it comes to Horizon 2020 and in research and health, well, there are a lot of research programs in this, and there is excellence in the UK, and a lot of that comes from the Horizon 2020 program. When it comes to industry, well, in the pharmaceutical industry, there was this reference to the 70%. Now, I don't know if it's 70%, but we do need to look into that issue, and certainly there is a lot of expertise in the UK, and there might be a risk of losing that in the pharmaceutical industry. Now, we also know that there are a lot of relations that are going to be of great importance between the two sides, and the standards will be of great importance with when it comes to healthcare and the way that those standards will be applied in the UK. And so we're going to have to uphold that throughout the negotiations. We need to make sure that there is not uncertainty. We can come up with data to make sure exactly what standards should apply and how we're going to be able to be sure that those are enforced. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this was the contribution of all members. And now back to you. First, Mr. Brok, comments on what you heard here as questions.
Thank you very much. I would like to take up a few points, not everything, and he will do the same and others together, but sorry that I have to leave then because I have a speech to deliver in my district.
That's important.
That's the most important part, close to the citizens. Ich glaube, wenn ich das mal...
I think, just answering in German, the transition rules, I'm generalizing this a bit. That means, as we see it, we'll stay with the standards and the rules that we have at the moment. There might be some differentiation, but basically that's it. After that, if we manage to put together things successfully, that we'll have an agreement negotiated with a third country. It's not the continuation of what we have now. It's something new. I have the feeling sometimes, hearing remarks from London and in this Parliament, that the most fervent supporters of Brexit are explaining that everything will stay the way it is. I read the British papers like an application for membership of the single market, apart from freedom of movement of labour and the ECJ and money. I've seen some examples of that here. Well, that's how I understood them. Many arguments when it comes to pharmaceutical products. That's what they're trying to say. That's the same arguments that we Germans hear. You can have third EU countries because BMW wants to sell so many of its products to the UK. That's an agreement with a third country. If you've decided Brexit, you must carry the consequences of Brexit because it would be unfair to the rest of us. You must do it properly. Under these conditions, we must find a constructive solution. I think the UK is rejecting the Norway solution, the EEA, and is rejecting the customs union. They don't want to have the obligations from that. They want to have a free trade agreement. But then not the plus. That that what you have in the single market comes back in there without the obligations. I think, looking at the bigger picture, we must keep an eye on that so that through the detailed rules that de facto we have the UK in the single market and the UK is free of the obligations coming from that. Second point. In a trade agreement, however generous that is in the interests of both, because the UK is what it is, the UK maintains the standards. Joe Leinen mentioned the regulatory committee. We discussed that with TTIP. I'm against a regulatory committee. It sets the rules without the Parliament being involved. These rules must mean that the sovereignty of this Parliament is maintained as a legislator, and not we don't have standards being negotiated by officials between London and Brussels. If the UK says we want to have autonomy when it comes to setting standards, getting away from Europe, I don't understand intellectually that they want to maintain these standards. That, I hope that over the weeks and months that the British proposals will help me to understand that. At the moment we can't understand it based on the proposals. And I wouldn't want to be led astray. And Michael Gove bought environmental protection. Michael Gove was a fanatical Brexiteer. He's always explained that he wanted to get away from European bureaucracy. In this area, where environmental protection is being called a large part of the bureaucracy, and now they're talking about standards in the European Union. I haven't understood that. But what is propaganda and what isn't? And what I've heard on agriculture also comes into that category. We should also make it clear when it comes to the quality of products that we address this with the UK as we do with any other third country. But if somebody has proposed that the European Medical Agency can be used, that the UK can be a member without being part of the governance, the UK must pay in. We have the discussion on Europol. Without, if you're in the governance, that means paying up. Today, in a talk yesterday with the Norwegian ambassador, that on Horizon, for example, or Erasmus, they pay a GDP-based contribution like any member state of the European Union.
This has to, of course, be guaranteed. But as concerns these various agencies, to be able to cherry-pick and have advantages, well, this is something which has to be considered more broadly. And pharmaceuticals and research, those sectors, well, we have to make sure that we keep what we have there. I mean, Great Britain, of course, cannot alone any longer have a critical mass in order to be successful, but it's in conjunction with us. Hopefully we can achieve it thereby. But I think that about 20-25% of funds of Horizon go to the UK, but we have to negotiate on that in terms of what happens if we're going to have any sort of a sensible agreement. I mean, as I said, about a quarter of Horizon funds go to the UK. And we're going to have to see how we can solve that issue. Now, I do think that these are the very bitter facts that we're going to have to sit down and hammer out together. Mr. Flanagan, your political group is a member of the Brexit Steering Committee group and, of course, is involved in everything. And so there's nothing that is being kept secret from your political group. I also think that we can have a good collaboration if you look at the individual issues that have been mentioned already. Animal welfare, for example. Well, that is part and parcel of European standards. And this is for environmental reasons, but also for food safety reasons as well. You see, this is belongs to standard setting overall. When products are delivered, then you have to look at EU standards and whether they fulfill them. Otherwise, there's a problem. We have to see that all in context. Now, I do think, as some of you said, we're going to have to look at standards once again, but we ought to look at what's happening in terms of the UK and the EU in terms... I mean, there must be some sort of model case that one can look at. I don't think that we should say 27 vis-à-vis the UK always. I think that, I mean, nobody should think that there's any special agreement in the offing here. I think that we have to make it absolutely clear always. That's the way, I think, to tackle the issues which are of common interest. And there was also a point mentioned about Euratom. Not only in terms of assets, but also safety controls. Safety controls, I think that's a problem, of course, which is very important. And perhaps you'd have to have a special negotiating chapter on this in terms of exiting Euratom, economic and environmental security issues, to have a look at all of those aspects. Now, I do think that we have to go into details at some point. What we're doing now is setting up the guidelines, in other words, for the second phase. Negotiations will be the first phase, and then EU would have, of course, the divorce contract, which has to come into effect in March 19, and then, of course, you have a transitional period, so you don't have things breaking down the next day. So the transitional period is what you're going to use, 2 years or whatever you need to come up with an ultimate contract. So I do think that we're going to have to look at this square on. I mean, as of March 2019, Great Britain would be a third country, even if there are special agreements in terms of the transitional phase. So we're going to be dealing with them as a third country, and all the consequences linked into that, of course, have to be looked at, so that we don't create any false hopes. And perhaps I can make also a comment in terms of migration, frontiers, and the UK on Brexit and the referendum and the struggle for that. It was said that the EU, in terms of the migration issue, is in fact, and people said that there's a responsibility there, and free movement in the EU was sort of interwoven with Syrian and Iraqi immigrants and refugees. I mean, France really has taken the brunt here in Calais and undertaken enormous endeavours. No, Great Britain, which is not in the Schengen Agreement and still has controls on its borders, I mean, you have to remember that. That's never been given up by the UK. And basically has let people in. So this is a major problem. Now, after Brexit, of course, France won't have that duty to protect, and then Great Britain will have to deal and tackle that problem, deal with the problem and tackle the problem of immigration itself. So Brexit believers really have to bear that in mind very clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brok. Now, Mr. Verhofstadt.
Now, if I listen to Mr. Brok, this committee covers everything, even the Le Touquet agreement between France and Britain. That said, we have used, and Elmar also, and many of you, many times the word third country. And Mr. Dance was not pleased that that we, and I should say with reason. The reason is very simple why we use it. It's not our choice. It's a choice by Britain and by the UK. If the UK, for example, says, yeah, freedom of movement is not possible, yeah, then an EEA solution is not possible. A Norway solution is not possible. When Britain says there can be no oversight by the ECJ, yeah, then an Ukraine solution is not possible because there is an oversight by the ECJ. When Britain says we want to regain our authority and our sovereignty to do the trade deals, then a customs union is not possible. The reason why we are talking about this is not a choice by us, it's a choice by them. It's their red lines who make that we go from a full membership to an EEA, not possible, to a customs union, not possible, to, and so on and so on. And that we talk today about an agreement with a third country. So they are the red lines who are indicating what we have on our table, and not a will or a choice from the 27 to say we want this or we want that. The only thing what cannot happen is that we can create a situation also on environmental standards, but that's the same for everything. If I talk about financial services, it's exactly the same reasoning. That is at the end completely undermining our union. In the way that, for example, now the UK is one of the 28. When we talk about environmental standards, they are sitting in the European Parliament, they are sitting in the Commission, they are sitting in the agencies, they are sitting in the Council of Experts, and they are working with the other 27, and together they make an agreement. And it could be from time to time that there is a blocking minority in which Britain can play sometimes, there are some examples of that, a key role, but that's the way it works. What we're going to not allow is that this system is replaced by a bilateral system in which, for every environmental standard, we have an EU 27 agreement and we're going to negotiate it with the UK. Then we can give up the European Union. Because that is giving the signal to everybody, go out and you gain power. You gain authority. And there will be on every environmental standard, on every standard on health service, a bilateral agreement between the EU 27, so the European Union of the future, and UK. That will not happen. We will not allow it. Not in environmental standards, not in financial service, in no sector of the European Union we will allow it. Because that is undermining the Union. And that's creating a new system in which a country is part of 28 and you replace it by a bilateral system in which those who go out gain a sort of a power to make bilateral deals with the European Union. The system has to be that the EU 27 autonomy to decide on these standards is completely intact. Doesn't change. There will be in the future consultations with the UK in the transition. There will be in the future arbitration system with the UK under the new system in the future relationship. if there are disputes with them. What we will never do is to undermine the autonomy of the 27 to decide on these standards and to apply these standards. So consultation in the transition, yes. Arbitration in the future relationship, yes. All this will be possible, but not the capacity and the autonomy of the 27 to decide on these issues, and then to ask to our counterparts, and our counterpart will be the UK, to apply them. And so there can be consultation on it, but there can be not an outsourcing of our autonomy of the 27, including European Parliament, to a new type of EU-UK autonomy deciding body, because that should be an outsourcing of our power, of our autonomy to another body. That will not happen. And I'm telling that because it is the same problem that, because I hear, as Elmar Brok hears it, everybody says, yeah, we want to keep everything like it is. No, it cannot be like that. That's impossible. And we cannot use this whole debate to diminish the power and autonomy of the European Union. Second point, we will never allow that the standards of the European Union will be lowered. That will the benchmark. The benchmark will be our standards, as we do always when we are talking about a relationship with another country, needs to be intact. That are the benchmark. Never lowering our standards, and these standards need to be in place. And this cannot be an exercise for a race to the bottom, to a race to lower these standards. It can be health standards, but it can be also the dance labour standards, because that's another issue, not in this committee, but in other committees. Third element that has been said, how to enforce it. There will be a specific system. That's clear. We have that in every agreement, with every third country, a specific system of arbitrage, but when it concerns the interpretation of union law, that will not be the arbitration who's going to do that. That's going to be the European Court of Justice we're going to do it. When it concerns an interpretation of union law, it will be only the European Court of Justice who is competent to do so. And that will be independent from the arbitration. Arbitration, for example, can at a certain moment, when it concerns an interpretation of union law, you have to refer to the European Court of Justice. We will not allow that an interpretation of union law will be outsourced to an arbitration body outside the acquis of the European Union and outside the structure of the European Union. And then on the transition, Mrs. Girling, the transition is part of the withdrawal. It will not be a separate issue. It will be part of the withdrawal, Article 50. That's one of the reasons that this transition cannot last 10 years, for example, because then it's not longer a transition, and then it's in fact not possible to make it part of the withdrawal. It can only be part of the withdrawal when this transition is limited in time. That's the reason why the negotiator of the European Union, Mr. Barnier, says until 2020, and we say maybe a little bit longer, a maximum of 3 years. But it will be part of the withdrawal. So when the conclusion or the agreement arrives here in the Parliament in October of this year, it will be Article 50 withdrawal, including transition, with eventually probably an annex. An annex will be a political declaration on the future relation. So I think, and I'm going a little bit faster now in the different remarks that have been made. I think it's absolutely also clear that solutions need to be found, but we know them. We have, for example, in the research, we have in Euratom, we have in EMA examples of how it works already with third countries, and we have these templates also to apply them in the case of Britain. Last remark to Mr. Flanagan, who said, yeah, are you the good negotiator because you're a federalist? Well, I'm in good company. Monet was a federalist, Schuman was a federalist, I'll say that Gaspari was a federalist. In my opinion, even Churchill was a federalist, even if he was a Brit, so I don't think that's a problem. And that I have said that some countries are dwarfs in the future world, all European countries are dwarfs. The only way to avoid that is to work together in the European Union. And that's not my invention. I think it was Paul Henri Spaak who said that. We are all dwarfs. Some know it, some for the moment have not the knowledge to know it, but they're going to know it very fast. And I think that's the reality. So I think that absolutely key is that we receive, if possible, Chair, on the 5 questions that I have put forward, maybe I can also or the services of the committee can launch them again to all members of your committee. It should be very important that we have your opinion about that. We're going to take that on board in the resolution. And Mr. Flanagan, I do that before. The resolution is not written. The resolution will be written at the end of February, at the moment that we receive from your committee the suggestions to put into the ENVI chapter. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
We thank you very much also. So we invite you to come again.
With pleasure.
We will have new steps in this long path of Brexit. So thank you very much again, President. See you the next time. Thank you.